Hiring managers, what's the most strangest thing a candidate did? When asked about strengths and weaknesses, the candidate replied, I crave KFC and often get myself a bargain bucket. I just didn't know what to say next, let alone whether they considered it a strength or a weakness. Not a hiring manager, but at a place I worked at, they were passing around an application of a guy who had to state that he had been convicted of a felony. He explained that a drunk driver killed his son, so he murdered the guy. Was out on parole. I felt bad. My first management job in IT, it was around 2001 or so. Hiring a General Windows Salary sysadmin. One guy comes in with a huge backpack. Do the interview, he's clearly on the spectrum, but I like him okay. Pretty smart, functional. As he's leaving, I casually ask, what's in your bag? He then explains that it's mostly O'Reilly books that he brings to all his interviews so he can prove people wrong if he needs to. Me, can you tell me about the gap in 2010 to 12? Them, I took time out to work on myself. Me, okay, so can you tell me why you left your last position? Them, I was asked to leave, and I have to disclose this, I embezzled from them. Me, so, did you work on yourself in prison between 2010 to 2012? Them, I don't think that's important. Now I Google people every single time before I interview them, smiley face. I interviewed a leprechaun once. He was a short, somewhat overweight guy that was of Irish descent, had red hair and a beard. He chose to wear of all things a green suit to the interview. It was hard to keep a straight face, especially when my interviewing partner mentioned a rainbow table, cryptography, and said our code was gold standard and lamented the construction going on at the Cloverleaf exit near the office. Your interviewing partner is the best kind of terrible person. Every workplace needs someone like him, tongue sticking out. We had a girl come in for an interview who brought her boyfriend. He didn't wait in the car, he actually wanted to sit in on the interview with her. When I explained that it wasn't protocol and he'd have to at least wait in the break room, he actually got angry at me. She wasn't a bad candidate, but I didn't want to risk anything to do with her boyfriend bleeding into our office. Edit, letters were missing in words. He said he was going out back to smoke a bowl after we were done and asked if I'd like to join him. I personally don't smoke and have no problem with people who do, but until it's legalized in our state, keep that shit to yourself during job interviews. Even if it is legalized, it still lacks professionalism, in a similar way to inviting your interview to have a beer with you. I was once really nervous at the end of my job interview and for some reason decided to stroke one of the office plants as the hiring manager walked me to the exit. Then I laughed awkwardly and said in a surprised tone, they're real. He was not impressed and I did not get the job. Question was, how do you install a CD-ROM drive into a PC? Answer was, you press the button, put the CD in, and follow the instructions on the screen. I was sitting in on that interview and my boss at the time hired her. We're still friends and I still give him shit for it. LMAO. Explaining why he left his last job, because I had to get up at the ass crack of dawn. Edit, I agree with him, totally valid reason, probably could have worded it better. I thought it was hilarious, personally. Didn't get hired because there were other people more qualified. Obligatory and not my job, but my boss is the hiring manager and has a great one. He received not a resume with like, bullet points and things you've done in past positions, but a first-person narrative giving an account of the applicant's viewing of the storming of the Bastille. The entire thing used flowery, extravagant language to describe the overthrowing of, a 1700s French prison, but then gave how that was very much like their proficiency at Word and Excel, and their history of promptness. This was for an entry-level assistant's position. Recent college grads, and the like. They didn't get the gig. I have a funny story about a guy we hired a couple of months ago. This guy had been working from home for a couple years and had gained some weight. He wore the suit he was married in for the interview with the senior guy here and bent over to pick up something and his pants split down the rear. Needless to say, he got the job. I was on an interview committee for an IT position, and I had shaggy, longish hair at the time. This kid comes in, has a pretty terrible interview, but he's confident the whole time. When we asked him if he had any questions or comments, he looked at me and said, I came in and saw your hair, and I can't believe they actually hire people like you. He was probably nervous, and I think his intention was to say that he's glad we don't just hire the typical professional-looking type. Unfortunately for him, it did not come off that way. I was learning how to do hiring interviews and one candidate showed up in jogging pants. Why do you wear jogging pants for a job application? No one ever recognized that. I use it instead of dress pants because they nearly look the same. It was really a WTF situation, because this is really self-confident he got the job. Okay, not a hiring manager, but the most cringe-worthy thing I did in a job interview yet was in an interview for a team leader position at Six Flags. The hiring manager asked me where I see myself in 10 years, and I told her head of operations of Six Flags Astroworld. At the time, I just got back in the US after being in Europe for 3 years. What I didn't know was Astroworld has been closed and all the rides were sold off and moved to other parks. She corrected me right away, and that was the end of the interview. I didn't get the job. Had a guy apply for a part-time sales position. He put a few random sales jobs as his work history. We called him in for an interview. He sat in front of me and said, "I'm not here for the part-time position I applied for, I'm here for the general manager position and that's all I'm taking." Okay, we're done here, thanks. Number 1, we weren't hiring for a GM. I joked with my GM about him secretly leaving and not telling me. Number 2, you lied on your resume and job app, which means I'm not even going to look at your next apps that you put through if the spot were to be available again. Number 3, you don't come in demanding a spot. Just yesterday actually. Ignoring my questions and going off on a tangent. Repeatedly. Cut that interview very short. Also had someone badmouth their old employer. Everything else looked solid and we were desperate and took the leap. Best decision ever. Great employee. I once had to hire a new manager at my father's hotel, so I put out a few adverts and drafted in a few potential candidates for interview. One of the candidates came in, but looked nervous as anything, so I tried to make him feel comfortable and asked him if he wanted to take off his jacket. He did, and as he did so, I spotted a pocket bottle of Louisiana hot sauce. I thought nothing of it and continued on with the interview. As he was leaving after the interview, he said, "There's one more thing you need to know about me." And proceeded to. I interview at least 5 potential caregivers a week to work with seniors that have dementia. We don't ask the typical job interview questions, we ask them a series of common scenarios they will encounter and see how they respond. One of the questions is, what would you do if you walk into a client's room and they start screaming at you to get out? The correct answer is some variation of leave for a few minutes and come back with a big smile on your face, and usually they will be happy to see you. One caregiver said she would bear hug the client into submission because she doesn't tolerate any disrespect. When I tried telling her that's the opposite of what you should do, she replied no, I would stick with the bear hug. Quite a few years ago, when hiring for a new store, we were interviewing thousands of people for 100 or so positions, so we did lots of interviews a day. I go through a whole interview with this one guy and it's pretty demure, nothing too bad, nothing amazing. I get to the end and ask the standard, do you have any criminal convictions etc. bit, and he says yes. I'm slightly surprised as there was a section asking that question on the initial application. I ask why he didn't put it in the application and he says, well, I knew you wouldn't interview me if I did. So lying about it and only bringing it up right at the end was a better choice? He's probably right though, isn't he? I mean, yeah, he didn't get the job, but he was better off than if he had put it down, if only in terms of a little more interview experience. I was doing interviews along with my manager once and we had a girl come in. She was very confident and outgoing, which was good because it was a sales position. She was doing all right until we asked about her current job. She was a waitress in a hotel, again fine, but she proceeded to tell us about how she ran the place. She was the newest person in this small place and she told the owners what to do. If she didn't agree with what they asked her, she'd refuse to do it. She very proudly told us all this like she was bragging to friends about the cushy job she had. Needless to say, the interview was over at that stage and we went through the motions after that. The strangest was probably when I asked someone to give an example of how they dealt with a conflict in the workplace, and his answer was that there was this time recently when a couple of guys were bullying him in the warehouse he was working in, or a friend of his, I can't remember, and he got his mate who was a real big guy to come with him and sort out the guys causing problems. This was for a call center job. Certainly a way to solve a conflict, but maybe not the guy we wanted to hire. I introduced myself to the candidate. Hello, I am John Smith. She responded, no, you're not. You're Tom Brown. I spent the next few minutes trying to convince her I was John Smith. I finally took my driver's license out and proved who I was. Did not hire. Not a manager, but I have a nice story. When I did an internship at a hospital, they hired new workers. One guy accidentally used his spam account and applied with the email, hardbody at something. The boss immediately told that everyone. Funny thing is he got the job and now everyone calls him hardbody. Had a girl hand her resume in, and she'd put a modeling course under qualifications along with a heavily made up selfie at the top of the page. I worked at a chocolate shop, my boss didn't give her an interview. My mom has worked in HR for about 20 years. She once had an interviewee tell the story of how his childhood friend and he were playing with actual swords, and surprise, actually stabbed his friend, fatally injuring him. He then discussed the psychological trauma it left him with. He did not get the job at the daycare. I am a hiring manager, the best I've ever come across is, so, I can see you have a 16-year gap in your employment history. What did you do during that time? Mainly just walked my dog. Vacant stares all around. I was interviewing an older woman for an IT job with my boss. We always ask a critical thinking question. Our favorite is give me 3 reasons a manhole cover is round. There are no wrong answers. The lady sits there clueless for a minute and says, well, my grandma is from Wisconsin and there are a bunch of Pollocks up there. I looked at my boss and said, apparently there are wrong answers. While part of the interview board for an open police officer position, one of the candidates told us the only reason that he wanted to be a cop was because we were hiring. He then spent the entire interview answering our questions by telling us why firefighters are better than cops. That is fine if you feel that way, but it is probably not a good idea to repeatedly tell a bunch of cops you're interviewing with that you don't want their job. Lady showed up late wearing a sparkly tube top and year's supply of eye makeup. She talked at length about how she was fired from McDonald's because the manager kept trying to tell her what to do. She needed 40 hours a week, but could not work past 3 p.m. because of her children. However, she loathed getting up early and would therefore not be showing up before 11 a.m. for her shift. After that, I just stopped asking her questions. Pulled out a cigarette and lit up. More detail, this was my first job in management. I was following the boss and this was the first interview I ever sat in on. Kid lit up, the boss just got up from the table and walked away without a word, left me there to awkwardly dismiss the candidate. Also, another guy answered his cell phone during the interview. Probably tame compared to some of what I expect in this thread, but was interviewing college kids for an internship, finished one interview, next one was waiting in the lobby. Walked her out, and she stood there glaring at the other candidate for a solid 15 seconds, it was very, very awkward. Just a note, she didn't know it was another candidate, she just assumed. Had someone bring a backpack full of cigars and weed to a professional office. She stunk up the waiting room and the smell went with her even when she left her backpack in the waiting area. She aced the interview and I hired her but let her know about our drug policy. She offered me a cigar and I declined. She ended up being one of my best employees. Shrug. Not said, but had as a phone voicemail. I had a candidate scheduled for a phone call, I called him and got his voicemail. It was a 4-minute skit of him playing the part of Dirty Harry. Do you feel lucky, punk? In the worst possible impression I have ever heard of anything ever in my life. To invite you to the scene, he was very Indian and perhaps Chinese mixture, his voice was nothing like Clint Eastwood, his impression missed key words and points of the phrasing. Overall the experience was memorable enough for me to call him back just to learn more about this guy. In the end he was not a good cultural fit for the work environment, so we didn't hire him, but goddamn was his voicemail hilarious. Not a hiring manager, but I had used the term lot lizard to describe a job I held at a Harley-Davidson after high school. It was on my resume for a few years. It took a girlfriend to inform me that a lot lizard is a highway rest stop prostitute that mainly services truckers. When I worked in a grocery co-op, I had some interesting interviews. One really sticks out in my mind. Me, why do you want to work with our company? Him, because you guys don't drug test. Me, we do random drug testing. What makes you think that we don't? Him, this is a co-op. You guys sell weed, why would you drug test? That's hypocritical. That's how we found out that the receiver on the loading dock was selling drugs out the side door. Had someone come in and seemed kind of shy during the interview. When it was over and he turned to leave, he pulled out a bottle of hot sauce and tried to drink the whole thing. He looked like he was in pain, but slurred, I can handle the heat. He kept going, then puked on my floor. Not about me, but a guy in my company years ago. During his interview with the hiring manager, they found common ground in their love of duck hunting. This guy asks the manager if he enjoys duck meat. The manager confirms that he does indeed enjoy duck meat. This guy then invites the manager to duck down on his meat while gesturing to his groin area. The guy was hired. Was a shitty employee for a year, then was fired after allowing too much of his personal life bullshit to affect him at work. The straw that broke the camel's back involved his girlfriend, who is also his cousin, selling all his shit while he was out of town for work. This is almost off topic, but it's so cringe-worthy I'm telling it anyway. For about a year, there was a flyer hanging in our local post office. It read something like this: my son-in-law, full name, is a really good lawyer and needs a job. He and his wife, full name, have 3 wonderful children and he really needs the work so he can support his family. If you need a lawyer, please call XXXXXXX. Edit, phone numbers have 7XS. We brought in a developer a couple years ago to interview. Now we have seen some strange guys, but this one was just so far past anyone else we've had in. There was one interview where over the course of the interview he sat down in 3 different chairs and at various points had his back turned to the interview. My favorite though, Lie and another guy were taking him out to lunch. To exit the building we had to go through a revolving door with 4 small compartments. My coworker gets in first, and this guy jumps into the same compartment behind him. Now this compartment was not large enough for 2 people, so he slams his back into the back of the door and makes a loud grunting sound. I'm glad I was behind them because I almost died laughing. I was the one being interviewed a few years ago for an office job. I walked into the room and there were 3 attractive women in their early 30s preparing to conduct the interview. I immediately blurted out, I've watched a lot of movies that started like this. They all laughed and I got the job because, it turns out, they were looking for someone with a sense of humor. I interviewed a guy and noticed in his references that there was a guy that grew up in my best friend's neighborhood and had played pickup basketball with when we were young. I mentioned this and asked how he was doing. Without the slightest pause he says, oh you know, still selling drugs. Before sending me a resume, they had sent me an email cover letter where they failed to include their name, but did take the time to inform me that they were a non-binary person with strong feelings about sexuality. When they arrived at the interview, they again failed to tell me their name and I had to prompt them a few times before coming right out and asking, and they thought about it for a bit before saying John. Midway through the interview, they changed their mind and asked me to call them Mary instead. And then at the end of the interview, they gave me a 3rd name. Might be too late, but I always found this hilarious. I run a call center and was interviewing a candidate in between calls. She was a rather large girl. She had been referred by a trusted colleague and her resume was stellar. During the interview, which was very professional, my lunch came. Hot wings. I put them to the side and continued the interview. I went great and I hired her on THD spot. We exchanged pleasantries on the way out. She stopped and said, man, let me get one of them wangs. Them shit smell good as a motherfucker. I gave her a wing. She's still my top producer 8 years later. Most memorable one was a graduate designer role we were interviewing for. A young guy came in who had a good portfolio and was doing really well. I forget the exact question that then made it all go wrong, but I will never forget his answer. He said, well, I am not one of those pretentious designers who masturbates to typography. While leaning back in his chair and lacing his fingers behind his head. As if he was utterly relaxed with this statement. Who says that shit? I honestly couldn't take him seriously after that, and barely remember the rest of the interview now. Poor kid. Head of HR, if you had to fill the position of Senior Vice President today, what's the one thing you'd hope to have in preparation? Me, a change of underpants. Senior Vice President, who sat in on the interview, visibly stifled laughter. However, the head of HR did not find my joke amusing. At all. Not cringeworthy but sad. Had a former pharmacist interviewing for an entry-level administrative assistant position. When asked why there was a huge jump in careers, not to mention pay, he told me he was hit by a drunk driver and became addicted to painkillers during his recovery, so he didn't trust himself with the ability to self-medicate. Really made me admire his difficult choice to walk away from his lucrative career. He seemed like an honest and good person. Hope he is doing well. Please consider subscribing if you enjoyed. Love.